On June 28, 1869, a 63-year-old engineer stood on the timber piles of the Fulton Ferry slip in Brooklyn, sighting through a transit to set the alignment for the towers of the longest suspension bridge ever designed. An incoming ferryboat slammed the rack and crushed his right foot between the timbers. Surgeons amputated his toes without anesthetic. He sent them away, dressed the wound himself with unboiled well water, and died of tetanus 3 weeks later. The Brooklyn Bridge killed its own designer before construction had even begun. His 32-year-old son took over, and within 3 years was paralyzed by the same project, supervising from a bedroom window through field glasses while his wife carried his orders to the site every single morning. This is the story of the machines that built the Brooklyn Bridge and the family it nearly destroyed. What we are about to cover spans 14 years of construction, 3 Roebling family tragedies, at least 20 documented worker deaths, and one of the most brazen fraud schemes in American engineering history. We will start with the political corruption that funded the bridge, move through the Caisson work beneath the East River, the fire, and the blowout that nearly ended the project, the epidemic that crippled the workforce, the towers and the cables, and the con man who poisoned them, and finally the opening day that turned into a disaster of its own. The man who designed the Brooklyn Bridge was Johann August Roebling, a Prussian immigrant who had attended Hegel's lectures at the Berlin Bau Academy before sailing for America in 1831. He settled in western Pennsylvania and spent a decade farming before inventing something that would change construction forever. In 1841, he developed a method for twisting iron wires into a continuous rope at his farm in Saxonburg, Pennsylvania, replacing the hemp lines that kept rotting on the Allegheny Portage Railroad inclined planes. The United States Patent Office granted him patent 2720 on July 16, 1842. By 1848, he had moved his wire rope factory to Trenton, New Jersey, the city that would later adopt the motto, "Trenton makes, the world takes." His Cincinnati to Covington suspension bridge, completed in 1867, held the record for the longest suspension span in the world at 1,057 feet. The Brooklyn Bridge, at 1,595.5 feet, would be roughly 50% longer than anything ever built. But Roebling could not build a bridge across the East River on engineering talent alone. Brooklyn, in the late 1860s, was the third largest city in the United States, and the brutal winter of 1867 had frozen the East River solid, stranding thousands of commuters who depended on the ferry system and crystallizing political will for a permanent crossing. State Senator Henry Cruz Murphy, the founding editor of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, drafted the chartering legislation from his Bay Ridge home in early 1867. However, Murphy could not get the bill through Albany without the backing of the most powerful man in New York City politics. William M. Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall controlled both cities from behind the scenes. According to multiple contemporary accounts, contractor William C. Kingsley physically delivered $60,000 to $65,000 in cash, packed in a carpet bag, to bribe New York City aldermen into authorizing the city's $1.5 million bond purchase. In return, Tweed and his associates, Peter Sweeney and Richard Slippery Dick Connolly, took more than half of the private stock in a company funded almost entirely by public money. Kingsley's own construction firm received 15% of all construction costs as a management fee. In 1870 alone, that came to $175,000, an unheard-of percentage for the era. Tweed was arrested in October 1871 and died in Ludlow Street Jail on April 12, 1878, of pneumonia, while the bridge was still under construction. The bridge was born in corruption, but the engineering that followed was something else entirely. And to understand what happened next, we need to go beneath the East River, into the most dangerous workspace in 19th century America. When John Roebling died on July 22, 1869, his son Washington Augustus Roebling was named chief engineer on August 3rd. Washington was 32 years old, an 1857 graduate of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and a decorated Civil War veteran. He had built emergency suspension bridges over the Rappahannock and the Shenandoah rivers under hostile fire. He had performed balloon reconnaissance after the Battle of Chancellorsville. And on July 2, 1863, at Gettysburg, he had scouted the Confederate advance at Little Round Top, spotting Hood's troops cresting Warfield Ridge and helping haul Federal artillery up the slope while bullets struck the rocks around him. He was an aide to Brigadier General Gouverneur Kemble Warren, and in 1865, he married Warren's sister Emily. Their European honeymoon in 1867 and 1868 was really an industrial espionage mission. Washington's father had sent him to study pneumatic caissons at British and French bridge projects, examine the latest compressed air technology, and bring back everything he learned about underwater foundation work. Like and subscribe. That knowledge was about to be tested on the largest scale imaginable. The two timber caissons that would become the foundations of the Brooklyn Bridge Towers were the largest wooden structures ever constructed up to that point. The Brooklyn caisson measured 168 feet long by 102 feet wide by 14.5 feet tall. It weighed roughly 3,000 tons. The timber was almost entirely southern yellow pine from Gascoigne Bluff on St. Simon's Island, Georgia, with oak reinforcing critical joints. The roof consisted of 15 layers of 12 by 12-inch yellow pine timbers, and by the time the work was done on the New York side, the roof had grown to about 22 feet thick. The exterior was clad in tin sheeting, the cutting edge was cast iron, and every seam was caulked with oakum. Both caissons were built at the Webb and Bell shipyard in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. The Brooklyn caisson was launched on March 19, 1870. It was the heaviest object ever launched in the United States at that date. 6 tugboats towed it into position on the East River, while crowds watched from the Brooklyn waterfront. Inside the caisson, the conditions were unlike anything workers had ever experienced. The compressed air chambers had to be lit, but coal gas overheated the air. Sperm candles blackened it with soot, and kerosene was considered too dangerous. Roebling settled on calcium lights, the same oxyhydrogen limelight system invented by Lieutenant Thomas Drummond in 1825. Compressed oxygen and coal gas were piped through iron tubes into the chamber and trained on a block of lime, producing an intense, flickering white glow that cast deep shadows across the walls. The excavation equipment included pneumatic rock drills manufactured by the Burley Rock Drill Company of Fitchburg, Massachusetts. These were Charles Burley's 1866 patent improvement drills. Each unit weighed about 240 pounds and could bore through rock at 3.3 inches per minute through 1 3/4-inch bores. Boulders pinned beneath the cutting edge were pried loose with 2-ton and 3-ton hydraulic jacks lowered through supply shafts, fitted with Lewis eye bolts drilled directly into the stone. Sand and muck were removed through 54-inch diameter pipes using a system borrowed from James B. Eades's sand ejector design on the St. Louis Bridge. Washington Roebling went down into the caisson regularly and wrote about what he found. In his 1872 report of the chief engineer, he described the noise of splitting blocks and posts as rather ominous, and noted that it was inclined to make the reflecting mind nervous in view of the impending mass of 30,000 tons overhead. He also recorded that the sense of smell was almost entirely lost in the compressed atmosphere, which he called a wise provision of nature, because foul odors certainly have their home in a caisson. The word impending captures the danger he felt. E.F. Farrington, the project's master mechanic, left an even more vivid account. He described the interior as a scene from Dante's Inferno, with flaming calcium lights casting deep shadows, the confusing noise of hammers and drills and chains echoing off the timber walls, and half-naked workers flitting through the haze like figures in some underground nightmare. We spent a long time going through the original accounts from this project, and what survived in writing paints a picture that would be difficult to believe if the sources were not so well documented. 2 catastrophes nearly ended the project before the caissons reached their final depth. The first was the Great Blowout. One Sunday morning, the water column in one of the muck shafts dropped below critical depth, and the caisson's compressed air erupted out through the tube. Roebling described the eruption in his own notes. The water, stone, and mud were sent up with terrific force to a height of 500 feet, accompanied by a dense cloud of fog from the rapid expansion. The whole neighborhood was covered in river mud. Fish from the East River rained down on the streets of Brooklyn. Even the toll collectors at the nearby ferry abandoned their tills and ran. By sheer luck, the chamber was empty when it happened. Anyone inside would almost certainly have been sucked through the tube and hurled 500 feet into the air with the debris. The second catastrophe was worse because it lasted for days. On the night of December 1st, 1870, at roughly 9:30 in the evening, a laborer named MacDonald held a candle too close to the roof seam between chambers 1 and 2. That particular seam had been overlooked when the others were sealed with cement. The exposed oakum caulking ignited instantly. MacDonald patched the burned area with plaster to hide what he had done, then disappeared from the site and was never seen again. The compressed air inside the caisson acted as a giant bellows, driving the flame deep into the laminated yellow pine layers above. Roebling went down himself and worked through the night alongside Farrington, drilling exploratory holes 2 and 3 feet into the roof timber to chase the fire's boundaries. By 5 in the morning on December 2nd, 1870, after 7.5 hours underground, Roebling collapsed and was carried out unconscious. It was his first attack of decompression sickness. The fire had eaten up to 5 feet into the 22-foot thick roof and spread horizontally as much as 50 feet. Roebling tried carbon dioxide extinguishers, steam pipes, and direct water streams. Nothing worked against the pressurized air feeding the blaze. After 2 more days, he ordered the entire chamber flooded. 3 fireboats and the Brooklyn Fire Department poured 1,350,000 gallons of water through 38 streams in 5 hours. The caisson stayed underwater for 2.5 days and settled by 2 inches under its own softened weight. Repairs cost approximately $250,000 and took 2 months of continuous labor. 18 carpenters worked day and night in 80-degree compressed air, breathing candle smoke, cement dust, and powdered charcoal. The Brooklyn caisson reached its final depth of 44 feet 6 inches on March 6, 1871, and settled into firm, rocky gravel above the actual bedrock at 97 feet. The lesson of the fire was applied immediately to the New York Caisson, launched on May 11, 1871, which had its roof and lower courses lined with sheet iron boilerplate as fireproofing. But the Manhattan side brought a far worse problem. The bedrock on the New York side was deeper than anyone had hoped, and the caisson had to descend to 78 feet 6 inches, nearly twice the depth of the Brooklyn side. The air pressure inside reached 35 pounds per square inch. Workers entering the caisson passed through iron airlocks and descended through access shafts into a pressurized environment that no medical textbook of the era could explain. And that is when men started dying. Dr. Andrew Heermans Smith, a New York laryngologist Washington had hired after reading his 1870 medical paper on oxygen therapy, documented 110 serious cases of decompression sickness between January and May of 1872. Smith was the first English-language physician to formally define the condition as Caisson disease, and he recorded the workers' own name for it. They called it the bends, mocking the stooped, doubled-over posture of suffering men who could barely walk after ascending from the pressurized chamber. The slang came from doing the Grecian bend, a reference to the fashionable forward lean of society, women walking in tight corsets at the time. The symptoms were brutal: severe joint pain, temporary paralysis, blindness, convulsions, loss of consciousness. Some men collapsed on the street hours after leaving the worksite, their blood literally fizzing with nitrogen bubbles that their bodies could not absorb fast enough. Smith prescribed shorter shifts, a doubled workforce to reduce individual exposure time, additional compressors, medical exclusion exams for anyone over 45, and steam heat in the chambers to keep body temperatures elevated. He never adopted recompression therapy, dismissing it as too extreme. That technique would not be proven until 1889, when E.W. Moore used it at the Hudson River Tunnel and dropped the worker death rate from 25% to 1.6%. The first worker to die was John Myers, a German laborer, on April 22, 1872, after only his second day in the New York Caisson. Patrick Mackay, an Irish laborer, followed roughly 8 days later. Daniel Reardon, also Irish, died within the same month. 3 men dead in 4 weeks, all from a condition nobody fully understood. After the third death, Roebling made one of the most consequential decisions in the entire 14-year project. He stopped the descent at 78.5 feet, still 30 feet above the actual gneiss bedrock. He calculated that the sand and gravel at that depth could support the tower's weight indefinitely. Most engineers of the era would have kept digging, driven by reputation and the quest for bedrock certainty. Roebling chose to stop and save lives. That decision almost certainly prevented dozens more deaths. In May of 1872, the Caisson workers went on strike, demanding $3 per day for a 4-hour shift. They were earning $2.25. Roebling refused. The company threatened to fire every man who did not return. Most came back within days. Many quit permanently, replaced by new immigrants who had not yet heard what happened underground. Washington Roebling himself collapsed in the spring of 1872 after working 12 straight hours in the New York Caisson and ascending too quickly. The symptoms were devastating and permanent. Partial paralysis of the legs, chronic joint pain that never fully subsided, blurred vision, hearing loss, a voice so weak he could barely be heard across a room, a nervous condition that made even short visits from colleagues intolerable. From the spring of 1872 until the bridge opened in May of 1883, for 11 years, Washington Roebling supervised the largest construction project in the Western Hemisphere, from the bedroom of his home at 110 Columbia Heights in Brooklyn Heights. He watched through field glasses, and every morning, his wife Emily Warren Roebling walked to the construction site, carrying his written instructions, meeting with the assistant engineers led by C.C. Martin, reviewing material deliveries, and returning each evening with detailed progress reports. Emily had no formal engineering education when this work began. She learned catenary mathematics, materials science, stress calculations, and cable construction theory directly from her bedridden husband. She met daily with contractors and steel suppliers. On at least one occasion, she sketched a specification drawing by hand and delivered it to a manufacturer who had come to their home expecting to meet Washington. When Mayor Seth Low moved to dismiss Washington as chief engineer in 1882, arguing that a man who could not visit his own construction site was unfit to run it, Emily personally addressed the trustees and the American Society of Civil Engineers. The vote to retain Washington was 10-7. Emily Warren Roebling saved the bridge and the Roebling name with it. Like and subscribe. While Emily managed the project from above, the towers rose over the East River. The granite came from the Bodwell Granite Company on Vinalhaven Island, off the coast of Maine, quarried primarily at Sands Quarry and Palmer Quarry. In 1872 alone, more than 600 men worked the Bodwell quarries cutting stone specifically for the Brooklyn Bridge. The contract called for 6,876 cubic yards of rock, faced random ashlar with 1.5-inch chiseled draft margins, set in Rosendale natural cement mortar with 1/2-inch flush joints. Limestone, used below the high water mark, came from the Clark Quarry in Essex County, New York. Each towers rises 276.5 feet above mean high water. Granite blocks weighing up to 9 tons were lifted on 350-foot, 1.5-inch steel hoisting ropes powered by steam hoisting engines, then set in place by topside derricks fitted into mortise pockets cut 4.5 inches deep for Lewis tenons. At each end of the bridge, the cables had to be anchored to something that would never move. The anchorages weigh roughly 60,000 tons each, built from the same granite and limestone as the towers. Inside each anchorage sit 4 cast iron anchor plates, each measuring 16 feet by 17.5 feet and weighing about 23 tons. Each plate connects to its cable through 18 wrought iron eye-bars that curve upward through the stone masonry. Roebling had patented this anchorage system in 1846 under U.S. Patent 4710 and scaled it up from his earlier Cincinnati Bridge. The patent steel trusses connecting the towers to the anchorages were fabricated by the Edgemoor Iron Company of Wilmington, Delaware, a contract plagued by chronic delivery delays that triggered a trustee investigation in 1881. The tower work claimed lives of its own. On October 23, 1871, a pair of derricks on the Brooklyn Tower collapsed without warning. John French was decapitated by the sheared boom. Workers named Doherty, McGarrity, and Thomas Douglas also died in the same accident. In December 1877, Neil Mullen, a widower with 5 children, was killed when an arch in the Brooklyn anchorage collapsed on top of him. These were not nameless statistics. They were men whose families depended on the $2.25 they brought home each day. Chief Assistant Engineer C.C. Martin later admitted to the Brooklyn Daily Eagle on opening day that if they had thought so many would be injured, they would have kept a complete list. But they never imagined anyone would be hurt. That admission tells you everything about construction safety in the 1870s. Before the cables could be spun, someone had to cross the East River on nothing but a wire. On August 25, 1876, at 1 in the afternoon, Master Mechanic E.F. Farrington sat in a bosun's chair. A wooden board hung from 4 ropes joined at a ring overhead. The chair was hooked to the traveler rope at the Brooklyn anchorage. Farrington was hauled across the East River, his chair rising up and over both towers, the river 276 feet below him. The crossing took 22 minutes. About 10,000 spectators watched from the shores and the ferry decks. Cannon fired. Whistles blew. Farrington tipped his hat partway across. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle ran a 1-word headline the next morning. Wedded. A temporary footbridge for workers followed in early February 1877, 4 feet wide, made of planks and wire rope handrails. A sign at the entrance read, "Safe for only 25 men at one time. Do not walk close together, nor run, jump, or trot. Break step." The walk across the footbridge took about 8 minutes. Workers described the planks swaying underfoot, the East River current visible through the gaps between the slats, and the wind hitting so hard on winter mornings that men had to grip the wire rope handrails with both hands and shuffle sideways to keep their footing. Cable spinning began on June 11, 1877, and ended at 4:45 in the afternoon on October 5, 1878. Each of the 4 main cables is 15 3/4 inches in finished diameter. Each contains roughly 5,400 individual wires of number 8 Birmingham gauge crucible steel, about 4 millimeters in diameter, galvanized. with a tensile strength of 160,000 pounds per square inch. The total length of wire spun into those 4 cables was approximately 14,000 miles. That is roughly the circumference of the Earth at the equator, and then half again over. A 5-foot white painted traveler wheel made about 23,000 round trips across the river, driven by a 30-horsepower steam hoisting engine at the Brooklyn anchorage. On the best single day, 88 miles of wire were laid up. Wires were spliced on site with a unique threaded male and female coupling devised on the project, known as the Brady splice, which was never used before or since on any other major bridge. Brady splice. The wire contract should never have gone to J. Lloyd Haigh. Washington Roebling had warned the trustees in writing before the bids were opened. "If you receive a bid from a Mr. Haigh of South Brooklyn," he wrote, "it will be well for you to investigate a little." But trustee Abram Stevens Hewitt, who was Peter Cooper's son-in-law and a partner in Cooper Hewitt and Company, introduced a conflict of interest resolution that effectively barred John A. Roebling's Sons of Trenton from the contract. Hewitt's firm competed directly with the Roeblings in the iron and steel business. Washington sold his $300,000 stake in the family company to allow them to bid regardless, but they still lost on price. Haigh, who ran the Brooklyn Wire Mill at 163 Imlay Street in Red Hook, got the contract in January 1877. Conflict. Haigh's fraud was devastatingly simple. Inspectors led by Colonel William H. Payne tested wire at Haigh's mill. Certified coils were loaded into delivery wagons, but Haigh's men diverted the wagons to a second building along the route, swapped the certified wire for rejected scrap that had been carefully reweighed to match, and sent the bad wire to the bridge under the original inspection certificate. The good wire went back to the mill and was presented for testing again, earning a second payment for the same coil. He also substituted cheaper Bessemer steel wire at the crucible steel price, netting an estimated $60,000 on that substitution alone. Fraud. Detection came when Colonel Payne secretly marked tested wire with a distinctive stamp and noticed something impossible. The rejected pile at the mill was shrinking instead of growing. On July 5, 1878, Payne ordered an 80-coil shipment tested at random. Only 5 out of 80 met the tensile strength specification. Payne then staked out a fence along the delivery route and caught the wagon switch happening in broad daylight. Detection. Like and subscribe. Roebling's response was calculated and pragmatic. He estimated that 221 tons of rejected wire had already been woven into the cables and could not be removed. In a long letter to the trustees, he wrote that an engineer who has not been educated as a spy or detective is no match for a rascal. But he also calculated that even with the defective wire incorporated, the original safety factor of 6 was reduced only to about 5. Still more than sufficient for the bridge to carry its designed loads. His solution was straightforward. Haigh would supply 150 additional good wires per cable, free of charge, as compensation. The trustees then voted to suppress the entire scandal. Solution. Haigh was never prosecuted for the bridge fraud. He went bankrupt in 1879 because the free replacement wire ruined his margins. He later served time at Sing Sing prison for unrelated forgery and check fraud. He died in poverty on January 6, 1917, reportedly arrested in old age for trying to steal an 8-cent loaf of bread from a bakery. The 221 tons of his defective wire are still inside the cables of the Brooklyn Bridge today, held in place only because John Roebling's original design had room to spare. One of the most dramatic construction deaths happened during the cable work. On June 14, 1878, a Bessemer steel fall rope snapped with a sound witnesses compared to a cannon shot. The freed cable strand whipped through the air, cleared 500 feet in a single arc, sheared a chimney and a telephone pole on its path through Brooklyn, and splashed into the East River, drenching passengers on a passing ferry. Harry Supple, 26 years and 7 months old, a native of St. John's, Newfoundland, was knocked 80 feet to the ground below. He never regained consciousness and died within 24 hours. His gravestone at Holy Cross Cemetery in East Flatbush reads simply his name, his birthplace, and the words, "Killed on Brooklyn Bridge, June 14, 1878. The bridge opened on May 24, 1883. The weather was clear and breezy. Schools and businesses closed across both cities. Special trains brought roughly 50,000 visitors from Philadelphia, Easton, and Long Island. President Chester A. Arthur rode at the head of 24 carriages from the Manhattan side and shook hands with Mayor Seth Low of Brooklyn and Mayor Franklin Edson of New York at the Brooklyn end. Henry Murphy, the state senator who had championed the bridge from the very beginning, was not present. He had died on December 1, 1882, 6 months short of the moment he had spent 16 years working toward. Emily Warren Roebling crossed the completed bridge in a carriage before the official ceremony, carrying a live rooster on her lap as the Roman symbol of victory. Workers lined the bridge and cheered as she passed. Washington watched from his bedroom window at 110 Columbia Heights through field glasses. He did not attend. Abram Hewitt delivered the dedication oration. He called the bridge an everlasting monument to the self-sacrificing devotion of woman, and declared that the name of Mrs. Emily Warren Roebling would be inseparably associated with all that is admirable in human nature, and all that is wonderful in the constructive world of art. Considering that Hewitt had spent years undermining the Roebling family's wire contract, the praise landed awkwardly at best. That evening, 14 tons of fireworks lit the sky over the East River in the largest pyrotechnic display New York City had ever seen. 150,300 people and 1,800 vehicles crossed the bridge in the first 24 hours. The toll was 1 cent for pedestrians, 5 cents for a horse and rider, and 10 cents for a horse and wagon, 2 cents for a sheep or a hog. 6 days later, the bridge turned deadly again. On Memorial Day, May 30th, 1883, roughly 20,000 people were on the bridge simultaneously when a woman tripped on the wooden staircase of the Manhattan side approach. Another woman screamed. Witnesses reported hearing someone shout that the bridge was falling. The narrow stairway became a crush of bodies. The New York Times reported the next morning that in a moment, the whole stairway was packed with dead and dying men, women, and children piled upon one another. 12 people died in the stampede, 7 were critically injured, 28 more were severely wounded. A bridge employee finally tore out a section of the iron fence between the promenade and the railroad bed, creating an escape route onto the cable car tracks. Pickpockets worked the chaos, while the injured were carried away. Restoring public confidence took nearly a year. On May 17, 1884, P.T. Barnum led 21 elephants and 17 camels across the bridge in the evening, with Jumbo, the most famous elephant in the world, bringing up the rear. The bridge had a static load capacity of about 18,700 tons. That is the equivalent of more than 2,500 African elephants standing on the deck at once. The stunt worked. The public came back. The final cost of the Brooklyn Bridge was $15.5 million in 1883, roughly $518 million in today's money. The original budget estimate had been $7 million. The construction bonds were not fully retired until 1956, 73 years after the bridge opened. Brooklyn paid 2/3 of the cost, and New York paid 1/3. At least 20 workers died during construction by the most conservative documented count. The real number, including men who later died from the long-term effects of Caisson disease and the 12 crushed in the Memorial Day Stampede, is closer to 40. Emily Warren. Roebling completed the New York University Women's Law class in 1899 and won its essay contest with a paper titled A Wife's Disabilities, which attacked the legal restrictions imposed on married women and argued for women's suffrage under the 14th Amendment. She was presented to Queen Victoria in 1896 and attended the coronation of Tsar Nicholas II. In an 1898 letter to her son, preserved in the Roebling family papers at Rutgers University, she wrote what may be the most honest assessment of her 11 years running the Brooklyn Bridge. She said she had more brains, common sense, and know-how generally than any two engineers, civil or uncivil, and that without her, the Brooklyn Bridge would never have had the name Roebling connected with it in any way. She died of stomach cancer on February 28, 1903, in Trenton. A plaque mounted on the bridge by the Brooklyn Engineers Club in 1951 reads simply, "Back of every great work we can find the self-sacrificing devotion of a woman." The Brooklyn Bridge was built with yellow pine from Georgia, granite shipped by schooner from a Maine island, Burley pneumatic drills from Massachusetts, calcium lights piped with compressed oxygen, and Roebling patent cable spinning driven by a 30-horsepower steam engine. 23,000 round trips of a 5-foot white painted traveler wheel carried 14,000 miles of wire across the East River. 221 tons of that wire were defective, placed there by a con man who died trying to steal bread. And the bridge still stands, carrying more than 100,000 vehicles and pedestrians every day, 143 years after a woman with a rooster on her lap rode across it for the very first time. Like and subscribe.